In 401 BC, a Greek mercenary named Xenophon found himself stranded in the middle of a foreign civil war. With his generals dead and the Persian army hunting his men across the Iraqi desert, his only option was a terrifying, exhausted sprint north toward the Black Sea. But as they fled, the mercenaries stopped dead in their tracks. Rising out of the dust was an immense, crumbling ruin. It was a ghost city, its shattered walls dwarfing anything Xenophon had ever seen back home in Greece. Xenophon asked the local people wandering the area who had built these massive fortifications. They had no idea. They couldn't even tell him the city's name. Today, we know what he was looking at. These were the ruins of Nineveh. Just 2 centuries earlier, this had been the capital of the Assyrians, the wealthiest and most feared superpower on the planet. A society that monopolizes global military power usually writes the history books. So, how does an empire of this magnitude manage to orchestrate its own absolute erasure from human memory? To understand their fall, we have to look at how they rose. Following the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC, Assyria was reduced to a vulnerable sliver of land along the Tigris River, completely surrounded by hostile tribes. Cut off from the trade routes that supplied rare copper, the Assyrians pivoted. They began forging weapons and armor out of iron, a metal that was incredibly abundant and easy to mass produce. This map shows exactly how that transition played out geographically. Under King Tiglath-Pileser III, the Assyrians stopped relying on seasonal peasant militias who had to march home every autumn to harvest their crops. Instead, they built a professional standing army. They backed this force with a dedicated engineering corps. When enemies hid behind high mud brick walls, Assyrian engineers built mobile siege towers and battering rams. When a river blocked their path, they constructed pontoon bridges and blew up animal skins to float their heavy chariots across. By standardizing weapons and professionalizing their ranks, the Assyrians built a self-sustaining machine of perpetual conquest. They could besiege a city for years if they had to. But breaking city walls takes time. The Assyrians preferred calculated psychological warfare. They widely publicized their own brutality, flaying rebels and burning captives alive, so that neighboring kingdoms would surrender out of pure terror. If a state did resist, the punishment was mass deportations. Entire populations were forcibly marched across the continent to labor in the Assyrian heartland. By uprooting people from their homelands, the empire shattered their cultural identities and broke their capacity to organize rebellions. The wealth and slave labor extracted from these campaigns flowed back into the capital, funding paved highways, botanical gardens, and an obsessive culture of learning. Kings like Ashurbanipal amassed libraries of over 30,000 clay tablets, meticulously documenting everything from astronomical data to the epic poetry of conquered nations. Assyrian scribes cataloged the movements of the stars on one tablet, while recording the systematic flaying of rebels on the next. The Universal Library at Nineveh was built on the ruins of every civilization the empire encountered. That brutality eventually turned inward. During the empire's final dynasty, the Sargonid kings, King Sennacherib became so frustrated with uprisings in the south that he burned the ancient holy city of Babylon to the ground. The act was considered such an abomination that his own sons assassinated him inside a temple. One of those sons, Esarhaddon, violently seized the throne and executed his brothers' families. The bloodshed left him profoundly paranoid. Desperate to prevent another civil war upon his death, he split the empire, giving Assyria to one son and the rebuilt city of Babylon to another. It was a disastrous miscalculation. King Ashurbanipal and his brother in Babylon eventually plunged into a 4-year civil war. The Assyrian army laid siege to Babylon until its starving citizens resorted to cannibalism, and the brother perished in the flames of his own palace. Ashurbanipal's campaign against Elam was one of total annihilation. He dismantled their cities brick by brick, carried away the bones of their kings, and sowed their fields with salt to ensure their culture would never rise again. Over 3 generations, the empire's logic had shifted. Strategic imperial control had given way to uncontrollable, self-destructive vengeance. This diagram shows the fatal consequence of that vengeance. By erasing Elam, Ashurbanipal destroyed his own buffer zone. He created a massive geopolitical vacuum on his eastern border, allowing an aggressive coalition of people known as the Medes to flow into the exposed Assyrian flank. Geologists analyzing cave stalagmites in northern Iraq have recently uncovered a secondary, invisible blow. Right as the border collapsed, the region was hit by a severe mega-drought. The seasonal rains that watered Assyria's vital agricultural base simply stopped falling. Starving and exposed, the empire fractured. When the Medes marched on Nineveh in 612 BC, Every subjugated nation from Babylon to Egypt seized the moment and rose up in bloody revenge. The world's largest city was completely flattened. With no goodwill to draw on and the agricultural heartland failing, the empire had no safety net to catch the falling crown. Once the overwhelming pressure from the Medes finally broke the eastern border, the entire structure came down at once. Towards the end of his life, Ashurbanipal commissioned exquisite stone reliefs showing himself hunting lions. The animals, pierced with arrows, cry out in agony. It was the ultimate projection of the Assyrian illusion, absolute control over a chaotic, violent world. The Assyrian military machine was incredibly effective at destruction. It was so effective, in fact, that its final victim was its own legacy. It left behind nothing but a fortress of iron, crumbling into unnamed ghosts in the sand.